Hi, and this is Chris. We want to start out with just having you do a little bit of R&R. It's not rest and relaxation. It's recall and revisit. What we want you to be thinking about, what do you plan to do now in terms of the evaluation of coaches in your district and your coaching program? And what from last week is still challenging or confusing? Because we know this is a really tough area. So I'm going to stop talking for a second and ask you to respond. Okay, I'm assuming you're all writing these really, really long answers, and that's why none of them have come up yet. But let Chris and I talk a little bit about what we're thinking would be really appropriate that you begin to think about in terms of the coaching. Great responses, thank you. I spent the morning with the Denver Public Schools area, all the metro area coach coordinators from Jeffco and Cherry Creek and Poudre, and we talked about evaluation and how hard it is, but how everybody needs to be having a plan for it. So that's really what we push you to think about, to actually make a plan to measure either your coaches and to evaluate them or to evaluate the program, or both, even better. And Sheila, one of the things you might want to think about is that from the very beginning, and I think the best time to have an evaluation program is at the very start. Because if you at least have 2 to 3 outcomes for this year, you want to measure them on an ongoing basis. And even just doing benchmarks in December, April, well, obviously December's gone, but April will give you some sense of you even moving in the same direction. In a district that I work with in Illinois, they just started this year and they've already done 3 benchmarks. And it's more around what are coaches actually spending their time doing, so you at least get an idea of what's going on there, as well as how well it's going with others. And their plan is in April, I think we have just designed a questionnaire we're going to be using with the users, which are the teachers and the principals of the coaching program and the coaches, so we have a good evaluation for year number 1. Okay, we're going to keep moving, but keep thinking about evaluation. And if you hear either Chris or I refer to anything today, please ask for copies of it. So if any of you want some information on what those districts have actually done, I can show you some of the data collection they've used, and this is year 1 with the program, and some of the way they've shared the data they've collected so far.
Okay, and I would just add to make sure that you think about what you want to accomplish and have that vision for where you're going. Programs that are put into place without that clear vision and outcomes in place really struggle. So you can see our faces up here, so Chris and Cindy, and there we are. Oh, can we go back to the outcomes?
It's not there.
Oh, okay. Well, let me tell you about our outcomes. So week 1, we talked about the characteristics of effective coaching programs, and then we defined what the coach-principal relationship should look like and how to form strong coach-teacher relationships. And then last week, we talked about how we might evaluate coaches and coaching programs to make sure that we meet our intended goals. So this week, we're going to consider some of the ongoing professional learning needs that coaches have. We know that typically coaches have a kind of personality that really seeks learning and the dispositions to really involve themselves in learning more deeply, and they're by nature reflective. So we're going to think about how we continue to feed our coaches. We're also going to look at the content for coach professional learning and a variety of options for how we might provide the coach professional learning. And then lastly, we're going to explore a variety of ways to support structures for coaches to help them to develop the dispositions, the mindsets, the knowledge and skills that they need to have to be most effective in their work. So you see this poll in front of you. There are various levels of support that we can provide to coaches. And so we want you to just take a look at this. Where do your coaches get most of their support? Okay, so it's looking like a lot of district support and a lot of ongoing professional learning opportunities. Okay, and not so much with peer, principal, external support. So through the course of this hour, we'll just be sharing with you some thoughts about how you might consider involving or implementing some other kinds of support for your coaches in addition to professional learning and district support.
And you know, one of the things you said in the last couple of weeks is that you talked about the need for principal support, and now I see one of you only kind of mark that area. We will talk today a lot about how do you work with principals to get them on board, because there is professional learning with them, and there are certain things you need to be doing with principals and coaches together that makes it much more effective.
Okay, so when we think about the kinds of professional learning that we need to engage our coaches in, when we model good professional learning by basing the professional learning that we're providing them on the standards for professional learning, that's the standard that we want to, think about. And when coaches are engaged in learning, as coaches, they're kind of processing on two levels. They're processing the kind of professional learning that they're receiving, and then they're also learning the content and thinking about how they can apply that to their work with coaches. And then if we think about layers of learning, the first layer is we need to think about what are the content, knowledge, and skills that teachers need to know about, that they're working with. And so in starting their work as coaches, coaches need to first understand how adults learn, and there's a nice table in your chapter about professional learning that gives some bulleted ideas about how adults learn. And then also they need to understand the human dynamics around change, like how do teachers go through, or how do people go through the change process. So having coaches spend some time getting familiar and really understanding various models of change so that they can use that feedback from teachers. Sometimes that feedback looks like resistance, but if they understand where people are in the change process, then it's just feedback to them about how they might support teachers through the change process. So once they have that adult knowledge, adult learning theory and change models information under their belt, then we need to provide some learning for them around content knowledge. So if they're literacy coaches, they've got to understand how to teach, or how to teach and how to teach others about literacy or math, or whatever content area. They also need to have skills around differentiation or ELL, whatever it is that your data tells you that your coaches need to focus on because there's a gap in student learning because of what the data is telling you. It's also important for coaches to understand how people learn, how children learn, and how they learn content or disciplines. Like how do children learn to read, or how do they learn to write, or how do they learn mathematical thinking? So all of that is important learning for coaches as well. Once we have some solid content knowledge and skill base for our coaches, we need to also then introduce them to coaching skills. And the coaching skills involve things like strong communication skills, also how to implement the gradual release model where we're co-planning, we're co-teaching, we're doing demonstration lessons with teachers. So thinking about that. And then as people are going through change, I know there have been some things in the chat room about Common Core and how hard that's going to be to move some people to that new way of thinking. And so having strong facilitation skills so that you can work with teams of teachers and create a culture of collaboration, a culture of inquiry, a culture where you're doing action research together, you're problem solving together, you're co-thinking. So all of those are some of those coaching skills that we need to look at. We're going to talk at you just a couple more minutes and then give you a chance to kind of give us some reflection on what we're talking about. Many of you mentioned the pieces on change that were in the chapter. We believe that every coach and coach champion, which means many of you, needs to have a theory of change. You need to be thinking about how do you believe the changes in classroom practice will take place? And what will you do as coach and coach champions to actually take initiatives forward, to ensure that initiatives are implemented at a high level. And in order to do that, you have to have some idea of how you think that change occurs. Now, when you were talking about evaluation, we talked about a theory of change, which like what you need to do when. What we're talking about now in terms of the change is how do people actually make changes? The model we like and use a lot is called the CBAM model, C-B-A-M, and it was referred to in your book as stages of concern. So either people call it stages of concern or CBAM, but you'll notice, and I've got the model up here on the slide. The biggie you need to be aware of is when you're working with a group of coaches making changes or coaches working with teachers making changes, everybody goes through all of the steps here. So when we talk about these stages, everybody goes through all the stages, and they do go through them in order. People have a different speed with which they go through them, and that's very much dependent on the person and the actual innovation or the initiative. But everybody has self-concerns first. And I think sometimes coaches get depressed or frustrated when teachers come back and constantly talk about how they're not sure it'll work for them or how can they do this in the classroom. And what people have to realize is that's a very normal process that everyone goes through. And as a coach, you need to take people through these stages. Because unless you get them to the task stages, they will just hang out down there in the self stages, which means they won't do any implementation. Because when your concerns are all about yourself, you're not actually implementing. And so, yes, Carla, we do use this with teachers when we have a new initiative. But mostly I use this when I'm actually working with a group and I hear their responses. So when I hear people respond in a group and whatever it is they say, I can figure out which level of concern they're at, and then I know what to do next. So along with the stages of concern, and we refer to some of them in the book, but there are lots of other readings that you can do on this. There are actual interventions at each of these levels that will take them to the next level. We found that as soon as they get through level 3, which is management actually being able to implement it in the classroom, then the rest of it's cake. They just move. But you really do need to have specific interventions that your coaches use and that you use with your coaches as they're moving through implementation. Because remember, if they don't implement, there's no change, so don't bother. The other one we use a lot is the other one that's kind of connected to the levels of concern, and that's levels of use. Dana, I will put up a couple resources in the chat room after we finish today that are references we use for the CBAM model. This one up on your screen now, I use a lot to assess. So you say you're doing this initiative at your school, Common Core, high levels of student engagement, cooperative learning, whatever it is. Are teachers really using it in the classroom? And I think you need to teach coaches how to measure the level of use, and you need to know how to measure the level of use.
Because if you have a coaching program, people aren't using them. Number one, that's one place you could use this. You could also use this a lot as you're just walking classrooms with coaches, or coaches are walking classrooms. In order to take teachers to the next step, or coaches to the next step, you've got to figure out where they are. And we find that with many initiatives, what happens is they're not even using it in their classroom because they haven't actually decided to use it yet. They're on the left-hand side here, the non-user side. So you really need to teach your coaches more about how do you actually collect the information. They need to be looking at it. Because if there is no change, then what you're doing isn't the right stuff. Because you need to be seeing the changes, and people need to actually be using the stuff. Okay, we've talked at you quite a lot here, so we want to give you a chance to give us some feedback about what you're thinking as you look at these. So now, as you look at these layers of learning and these two models, the levels of concern and the level of use, what are you thinking? How will you include that, and how might you use it with your coaches and then have coaches use it in their schools? We actually do teach this to our coaches. We give them this model of change, and we also teach it to groups of teachers. You're absolutely right, Katie. You do listen for words, and they tell you what the stage of concern is, and then you decide on your next step at that point. And Carla, we spend about 3 hours with coaches, and here's what we teach them. We teach them the levels of concern. We expose them to the levels of use. And then we also use Michael Fullen's work around resistance to change, and we promise we'll put them up there as well. But we spend at least 3 hours, and we keep coming back to it as we're working with our coaches to find out what they're thinking.
And a response to the monitoring, so systems or schools monitor some of the levels of implementation by having like a levels of implementation map to look for whatever it is that they're implementing, doing walkthroughs, having teachers meet and plan based on where they want to get to the next level in terms of implementation. So I think all of the stakeholders, the peers, the coaches, the teachers, the principals, everybody can be monitoring or self-monitoring for levels of implementation.
Especially if what you're monitoring for is not compliant, but it's to give the coach and the principal information about what do they need to provide next so that teachers can move ahead. If it's used as punishment, then it will not be a good situation. But if it is used as information to drive your next professional learning or drive individual support you give to teachers, then they're mostly okay with that. I think so, Katie. There's probably a 1-to-1 correlation somewhere, though. We haven't done that. I think we're ready, Chris, to kind of move on a little bit to the mindsets of coaches. And the mindsets of coaches, and I know that several of you, I think Robert and somebody else also mentioned they really like this chart. We believe that we can teach coaches lots of content things. I can teach them how to do things, but it's the attitude piece that often holds coaches that are not successful back. And I don't know that I can really teach people some of these mindsets that need to be there. I can keep pushing them toward the right-hand side here, but I can't direct teach any of these things. So let's kind of quickly talk you through this. Some of your coaches are walking in there thinking they get to tell other people what to do. They're going to get to do, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do that. Instead of inquiring about how does the teacher think about this work, what is it that teacher needs to be considering as they do it, but much more of an inquiry approach where the coach's intent with the teacher is to understand what the teacher is doing currently and how they're thinking currently. Now, I have to take a tiny bird walk here because Joellen put up a study, a relatively thick study of 300 and something pages up in the chat room, on the community forum. And I looked at it and thought, there's no way I'm reading that. But I went and started reading the summary, and there was some really good stuff on how we actually get teachers to use new strategies that kind of fits in with this directing and inquiring. So I want you to be thinking about that. Could be another resource for you. Sometimes coaches walk in thinking that their job is to correct people, to tell them what they're doing wrong, and so they have a focus more on technical coaching, which is the absence and presence of certain behaviors. And we found that from our own experience, and we've worked with a lot of technical coaches, as well as cognitive coaching, all those pieces, but that people were pretty resistive when they were being told what to do, or there was a checklist of, did I do it right, did I say the right words? Your coaches really need to move toward providing people with feedback that helps them look at their own practice and make some of their own assessments about where are they in relationship to the defined practice. And then the last piece of the first three here is instead of just accepting the problem, so it's like what we call problem admiration, where, oh yes, we have that problem, oh yes, we have that problem. They need to be focusing the coaches on what will we do about that problem. So that I tell coaches you should be a broken record. So yes, we have a 25% increase in second language kids this year. That is tough. We have a whole new challenge in front of us. So what are we going to do about it? So it's constantly giving coaches those words that they can use with teachers so that teachers don't get stuck on problem admiration. And the next one, thinking about focusing on strategies versus focusing on beliefs. So Simon Sinek, who is an anthropologist, did a TED video, and he said that most people, when they implement a new innovation, they start with the what we're going to do, the how we're going to do it, and they then get to the why we're going to do it. And he said effective leaders, he studied all these leaders, and he said effective leaders do it completely the opposite. They start with why, how, and then what. So think about all these innovations we have in schools. We have to give the state assessment. We have to implement this math curriculum. And teachers are marching along, implementing these strategies, implementing these programs, and we aren't focusing on beliefs. And so when we get to the why we're doing it, and when teachers understand the why, then we're much more likely to make the change that we need in schools. Just an example, there was a school district that was implementing a math curriculum that had a really strong spiraling curriculum, and teachers didn't believe that that was the right way to teach math because it went against all of their past experience. And so they really had to see that program being successful before they were able to get to their beliefs about how children learn. So I think that's part of that expertise piece that we want to work with coaches around, is really having them be able to tap into teachers' beliefs that they work with rather than going in and focusing on strategy. And then often we work with people who are making excuses because it's easier to deflect than it is to think about all the possibilities. So, for example, a teacher might come in to a coaching situation and say, my students are so far below grade level, I'm expected to have them on grade level by the end of the year. That teacher last year just didn't make the growth that she needed to with those students. So as a coach, instead of focusing on those excuses or going there,
generating possibilities. So it's really important for you to have your students on grade level. What is your plan to make growth with your students? What's your first step? What support do you need to get there? So focusing on the possibilities versus excuses. And then the last mindset we have here is advising versus listening. So when we advise, we feel like we have to be the smartest person in the room. We have to have all the answers. And sometimes teachers want to put that on us. You know, they want you just to tell them. So what differentiation strategy should we be using here? There isn't any change or any growth in the teacher when we're just advising or telling. And also, if we are advising, our advice is often falls flat because teachers choose not to use it. So when we listen, okay, what are you thinking? Knowing your students, knowing their needs, what would be a next step for them? We're much more likely to make inroads with teachers in terms of their thinking, in terms of their capabilities when we take a listening stance versus an advising stance.
So as you look at all of these mindsets, I think as we said in the beginning, we think it's hard to teach these mindsets, but we think it's really important that you work with your coaches on these mindsets. Plus, you need to model them. If you're the coach champion and you're doing any of these things on the left, you need to be moving to the right. Because if you're not modeling it with coaches, how do we expect coaches to use it with teachers? You're talking here about the mindset. So we want to kind of pose a question to you, and we want to hear your kind of thinking, and then Chris and I will share some of ours. So what structures would you put in place in your work with coaches that would help them make some of those mind shifts? Okay, the role playing, providing feedback to one another, those learning focused conversations, Andrea, those are great examples, okay? I'd also say that you need to be giving feedback to your coaches and modeling for them. And so giving coaches opportunities to practice and get feedback is really important.
Okay, and Robert, yes, seeing the strategy in action. So doing demonstration lessons is a powerful way to begin to interact with teachers, but not staying in that demonstration role, because teachers will let you stay there forever. So, you know, getting there and then moving out.
So in a second, we're going to talk about some other structures that we put in place when we work with coaches to help them with this piece. But we also want you to remember that whoever's working with the coaches has to give them opportunities to make those shifts with you in your work with them so that they can actually go back and do it with teachers. They do need to practice this. Practicing is a really big piece of it. So here are some strategies we use on a regular basis in terms of actually working with coaches. And so I see, Linda, you also said just making coaches aware of the chart and having them self-reflect is real important too. So here are actually two strategies. We kind of combined a couple here to talk about. And in your book, they were tools 7.10 and 7.11. And also, Tom, you put them up, didn't you, in the community forum so that everybody could look at them. These are the two strategies we use a whole lot. Coaching the coach is number one. And this is where the coaches actually, the focus is on the coach. So the coach chooses something they would like to have other people give them feedback on. And often we form what we call critical friends groups. CFGs is what we call them, and they stay together for half a year. They can stay together for many years, but they're kind of a small group that coaches the coach. And everyone in that group picks a situation where they would like some feedback. It can be on site, or you can just do it, bring a teacher in or bring a group in and facilitate a conversation. Everybody watches and then gives you feedback. The protocol we often use for this is called a descriptive review. So there's not judging of the coach. You're really modeling those same inquiry, asking questions, and it's almost like an observation for a teacher, but it's an observation of a coach. Also, as supervisors of the coaches, we often do the same thing where we coach the coach. We had a program in the district once every 6 weeks. One of us was on-site coaching the coach. And they choose what kinds of situations they want to be in and where they want feedback. And then either a group of coaches, their peers, give them feedback, which is what we were talking about before with peer support. Or a supervisor might give them feedback about what they're actually working on. So it's a way for the coach to get some feedback. So that's number one of the structures we use. Another structure we use is the Learning Lab, and that's one we took from PEBC, which is Public Education Business Coalition, and it is noted in your book as well. Denver Public Schools probably did some of the best work in this area, and what they do, and they still offer Learning Labs, is a teacher at a site agrees to be the host teacher. And then a group of coaches and teachers come together and they help the teacher work in an area they want to work on. So it's really focused on whatever the host teacher wants to work on. And they're doing a lot of this as they're implementing Common Core. So they picked an area to work on, everybody watches, they all meet with the teacher, they talk about strategies, they talk about what worked, they didn't work, they look at the student work. And then they actually talk about redesign, and they redesign the lesson with each other. So that really is another strategy we use that helps coaches actually, we teach them those strategies and then they use them with groups of teachers, but that helps them actually look at that. Comments on either of those or questions you have? I'd also like to say you may not want to wait until next year. A lot of districts we're working with are implementing one or two things at the end of this year after testing. So what they do is they get some practice with it and they find out what works and doesn't work and what are the kind of the challenges in the particular strategies. Mary, no, the lessons not taught again, that would be more lesson study, and we also use that model. But these are two biggies we use that are a little different. We thought you might not know these two, and you probably knew lesson study. But lesson study for sure is one we use a lot. So at the beginning of the session, we asked you to think about what types of support you might provide to your coaches, and we identified 4 types of support: district, peer, principal, and external. And so we're going to give you or highlight one example of district support, and that's the coach champion. So the coach champion is a district level person. It can be a district level professional developer. It can be a district level executive level person, but somebody who has the vision and really keeps the focus on what the coaching outcomes are. And that coach champion's role is to support the coach and to work with the coach. They often are the person who takes the lead and provides most of the professional learning for coaches. They can also coach the coach, so give that feedback to coaches on a regular, ongoing basis. The coach champion often and should often meet with the principal and the coach
to iron out any difficulties, any problems, any challenges, to identify successes, to make sure that the work at the school is staying focused where it should be, that if the coach is being asked to do things that isn't in their job description or takes their time away from where their focus should be, that the coach champion can help make sure that the program gets back on track. Ideally, the coach champion meets with the principal and the coach at least monthly. And we find that if there is a ratio of about 1 coach champion to 25 coaches or 20 coaches, that is pretty doable for them to do that. The coach champion can help mediate challenges that the coach might be having at the school with teachers, with resistance to coaching, that kind of thing. They may or may not evaluate coaches. What we find is that ideally they should not evaluate coaches, because when they are the evaluator and their advocate, then it's harder sometimes to develop and maintain that trust. And coaches sometimes don't feel as free to take risks or to share things that they might if the person was not also their evaluator.
Let me answer a couple questions you have here. I'm trying to type really fast, but I'm not a very good typist, so I'm too slow for this. Strategies to advocate for this position. What I would say is you're spending a lot of money on coaches. Do you want coaching to be successful? And if so, you've got to have somebody who gives feedback to coaches, who helps them think about their work, who has the big picture. In Jefferson County, Chris and I and Heather all did an audit of their program. And they had one kind of major coach champion, but then several people who supervise, because they have 110 coaches. But they really, in the audit, that was a huge issue for them, because they didn't have enough people that were there to support the coaches. And that came up as a big area of need. And what happened is they made a decision that they needed to put more money into that in order to make the coaches effective. But that came through an audit program, so that might be one way to get that. And Michelle, when you talk about principals assuming the coach champion role, they have to be coach champions too, as Chris just talked about. But the principal, if the principal's evaluating for them also to be the coach champion, is sometimes hard. And I don't know that they have the big picture. There's got to be somebody in the group who has the big picture of the coaching program. Where is it going to go? What are next steps? What are the next roles? How do I put this together? What's working about the program? What isn't working about the program? If there's nobody who takes that role, then everybody's just like different islands, just like teachers are in the same building when nobody takes the role of bringing it all together. So we see that as an absolute essential, is to have that coach champion in place. And so, Carla, it may be your director, but they've really got to be a person who understands coaching and is constantly there advocating for coaches. Because sometimes what happens is the central office just says, oh, the coaches can do it. Oh, but that's another thing, the coaches can do it. Somebody's got to protect the coaches from ending up with anything and everything the district tries to implement once they realize how good they are. So that's a big piece, a really big piece. Somebody's got to watch for that. Other questions about your coach champion, because next we want to move into a little bit of the scenario and do a little bit of problem solving around that. I agree, Linda, it is a challenge, but it is a dream job. I loved my job when I got to be that person, because it really entails being creative as well as helping people think things through. So I wanted to add one more thing. Because the coach champion gets to see the whole coaching program, or a large part of the coaching program, if they're working with 20 to 25 coaches, they're able to connect coaches to other coaches. They're able to connect them to resources. So they can really be kind of the thread that holds that coaching program together and keeps it working smoothly. All right, so let's go ahead and we're going to move to this next one, which is the scenario, as Cindy mentioned. And just a reminder that each chapter has a scenario, and the purpose of these scenarios is just to put the content of each chapter into context.
So in Chapter 8, the scenario, which you could find if you have your book, is on page 97 and 98, or you might have downloaded the copy that Tom put up for you to download. But each of these scenarios is also followed by some reflection questions, and the reflection questions are put there as a guide to help you reflect on the scenario. But we're going to just ask you to take a few minutes to consider this scenario, which is at the end of Chapter 8, page 97, 98, or the one that you downloaded. And in this case, this is an example of one type of peer-to-peer support. So we're going to be quiet, and we're just going to let you look that over for about 90 seconds, and then we'll come back and we're going to ask you a couple questions about it.
This is kind of read or revisit. So we put a question on the screen, if we could get some reactions to that. Absolutely, Trina. And how do you think that model worked for them in terms of helping that person? Perfect, Jacqueline, because it's easy for coaches to be resource providers and not to take on other roles. It's an easy role, and it means you don't really have to take many chances if you're just the resource provider.
But if this coach is working with this novice coach, then he needs to develop trust. And sometimes that's the purpose of that resource provider, is just to build trust. So the caution is, yeah, that you don't want to stay there. But it's not that you never, ever want to support through providing resources.
Great idea, Katie. The reframing piece is an absolute skill that we also teach coaches, that we think coach champions need and coach mentors. And that she also offered to model the data discussion. In several large districts, every new coach has a mentor, and they work with them on a regular basis, and they get small stipends. So that's another way to think about this. Can you think of some other support actions that the mentor could have taken that might have also been helpful to the new coach?
Okay, yes. Encouraging them to work with grade levels, getting beyond the data team. I'd also say, so the mentor offered to facilitate a data conversation. He also could have offered to co-plan a conference or a team conversation. He could observe, he could give feedback. might return to the why. Okay. Okay, and having those partnership agreements are very important. And I think when they're written, then you really can go back to them and be accountable to them, and then also revise them as needed, so that they aren't, in stone. We can always update them anytime we think that we need to.
And as Chris is talking about those partnership agreements, I just had this conversation this morning with this group of coaching champions, is that on a regular basis, if you go back to those, if you say, are we adhering to them, are we living with them, what do we need to change, so that you always get to go back to thinking about how we're spending our time, which is what Lynn is responding to there. Doing an actual schedule of how you're going to spend your time, then keeping your log, and then looking back and comparing the two is a really important piece. It's easy to get caught in spending your time on putting your finger in the dam rather than trying to figure out what the real issue is. Absolutely. Great. We're going to keep moving here in terms of just a couple more things, and we want to answer some of your questions from last week and spend a little bit of time on two issues. One is, how do coaches get time to spend with teachers? How do teachers get time to spend with coaches? And then the whole one around evaluation and work with Common Core. So we believe that you need to be differentiating the professional learning and support you give to coaches, and that not every coach is going to need the same thing, just like every teacher is not going to need the same thing. So when you're thinking about how do you support coaches to be successful, you need to think about what kinds of experiences do they need to be successful. So sometimes you differentiate based on experience. Some people have been in the job a year, 2 years, 3 years, and you always have to have a plan for the brand new ones to pick up on the content that was not gotten when you first started the program. Most of the time we would tell you you need about 5 days of training to kind of kick it off so that people really understand what their job is. And then we would tell you you probably should have training once a week, at least that first year, and the equivalency of, we would say, about a half a day. And that all of the time, all of these supports are ways, and then aren't direct instruction training. They are more sharing practices, practicing things, getting feedback, maybe learning some new content as well. And so if you have some coaches that are 20-plus year and then some are brand new, you have different types of experiences for different small groups. Sometimes we did those by level, so that's the context piece. Sometimes we took the primary coaches, sometimes we took elementary coaches, sometimes we took secondary coaches. We believe the job of middle school and high school coaches is significantly different than the job of elementary coaches. There's a different context. The people they work with are different, have kind of different personalities, might we say, as well as different challenges. And so you don't always do the same thing with all of the people all of the time. So some of the differentiation comes within sessions, and some of it is having totally different content, process, thinking. Also, your one-to-one, where you have either mentors, which are the peers, or the coaching champion working one-to-one with a coach, the conversation could be totally different coach to coach. We really try to tell people it doesn't always have to be the same. One group we work with has mentors for all new coaches, and they have like a general guideline. And if I can find that, I'll put it in the forum, but again, I have to ask permission. But they have a general guideline of kinds of things you talk about when. So Carla, you're asking, how do you best design this for the year? I tell you, just like I tell schools, that you need to design it at the beginning of the year. And then you can change it and shift it around as you're going through the year. But people need to know what it is they're going to get, when it is they're going to get it, and how they're going to learn these things. Mm-hmm. The other thing we tell you is that some of your coaches have more expertise in certain areas than others, so they can do a lot of the teaching of one another. It doesn't always need to be an expert from the outside. And I would tell you that many times the people on the inside who are doing the coaching at that time have had an experience. The other thing we really try to get coaches to do is to, every time they come together, there's some sharing of best practices of things they're doing and the results they're getting with teachers. We would also tell you need to have a place where coaches can all put their work so they can steal from each other. So if you're implementing a new math program and everybody's working on, let's say it's an environment, why wouldn't one person do some training on that and then share everything they've done with somebody else, and they can adjust it as necessary? But we think that's real important. Questions about what actually goes on for the professional learning and support before we kind of move on to some of your questions? Next area we just want to spend a little bit of time on, because it came up in the chat a lot over the last 2 weeks, is the area of how do you find time? Some of you have no time built in for teachers to work with coaches during the school day. And I'd like to find out, how are you actually providing time right now for teachers to work with coaches? And then we'll kind of share our ideas after you share some of yours. Great ideas. Carla, you've got some great ideas about redesign. You can do things with your schedule where you have time built in, like, I can't remember who said it, that you have Fridays, you have a consult time. Some people are actually able to redo their PLCs, so the coaches are in there doing their PLCs and actually having conversations. Sometimes they're willing to give up their planning time to do it, or after school or before school. And yes, the brief people, you're right. The time comes wherever you can get a place for it where the people are willing to do it. But if you have PLC time or some other time like that built in, it seems to be the easiest.
And Dana, I think you had asked earlier about what do you do in small school districts. And so sometimes people in small districts or rural areas do things like form groups on Google Hangout or someplace like that online, and they, support each other. It's kind of that peer learning based on what they have identified as their needs.
We also find sometimes our coaches facilitate online conversations across schools in rural districts, or even across schools in large urban districts where at some levels, elementary level, there's one music teacher, there's one PE teacher. And so you have an opportunity to help people across schools, which are helpful. Great, Lori, that's a gift. Great. Use of Edmodo is a great strategy as well. We've used that a lot.
Some people are using a gradual release model where they're saying, I'm going to work with this team of teachers for this many weeks so that I can do a demonstration lesson, we can co-plan, we can co-teach, and then I will observe and give feedback and then move on to another team so that you're not working with every team at the same time.
We have about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to make sure that we at least do a little bit around recommendations to make sure that we have an opportunity to talk to you a little bit about that.
All right, so as you know, every chapter has a set of recommendations at the end of the chapter, so we've just chosen a few from these 2 chapters. So from the central office perspective, we'd like you to think about when does it make sense for the coaches and the principals to have joint training or joint opportunities for professional learning? Is there an initiative that you want to be implemented at the district level, and you want everybody to be hearing the same thing and speaking the same language so that the coaches can support the work of the district or the focus of the district? So having that joint time. And then building administrators to be thinking about, how do I find time and how do I make it a priority to meet regularly to assess the impact that the coaching program and that the coach themselves is having on student learning in my building and on impacting teacher practice. Often when we've asked administrators about the effectiveness of the coaching program, they typically say, it comes down to the individual coach. And so if building administrators aren't making that time to meet with their coaches, to give them feedback, to make sure that they are supporting them and answering their questions, giving them the support, the resources that they need to do their work, then you will have the type of success that you're hoping for. And then coaches, be thinking about the fact that it is the principal who is the instructional leader in the building, and how do you support the principal in that work? And how do you communicate with the principal to make sure that you understand that principal's vision and that you have a joint vision for your work in the building based on where the school needs to go? So as we wrap up for today, we want to make sure we kind of give you a chance to respond. And Trina, we'll get back to you on the Alberta piece because one of us is doing some work up there. When we think about looking back, we want you to post some reflections on support and professional learning. In the book, we know that there are some tools that actually outline what happened, like some examples of schedules of professional learning for groups of coaches. But if any of the rest of you have any of those would be great. Or if you've defined your support in any way, like if you have a job description for a coaching champion, that would be wonderful to post there as well. And any other questions you have. I promise that I will try to send you the things we talked about today. And if I forget, just please remind me in the forum, and then I'll get it to you. We are going to ask you to read Chapter 14 for next week. And we really want you to think about this. What do you need to be mindful of as you think about the future of your coaching program? One of the things we have realized have actually hurt coaching programs is when they have defined what they are and then they just stay the same. And they don't shift their focus, their practice as things move forward. Just like teachers need to be redoing and refocusing their work, so do we as coaches. And when you stay the same and don't look about what's coming down the road, then you aren't as effective as you might be. So we want you to really, that's going to be a large part of our conversation for next week. So Tom, do you want to do any last wrap-up?
I absolutely do. Oh, did I click on? Am I on? Yeah, I think I'm on.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Cindy, and thank you, Chris. Another good hour today. So we discussed a lot of stuff in the chat room today about links and books and resource docs, and I will go back through all this stuff, and we'll try to get as much of this up as possible, hopefully with some help from Cindy and Chris, who I think recommended some stuff as well. So if you guys would post anything that you mentioned during this hour, and then I'll go through everyone else's and see if I can put some stuff up. And Dana, thank you you already emailed me one of the resources that you mentioned, so thank you. Okay, well, I will send a link to this session out later on today. And again, I mentioned this at the beginning of our hour. I'm preparing our evaluation for our program for next week, and so would appreciate if everybody took some time after next week's session and filled that out. But for now, be on the lookout for your usual Tuesday afternoon announcement from me with the link to our session and a few notes in there. And once again, thanks for another great hour. And it's the top of the hour, so we're going to let everybody loose and have a wonderful rest of your week. So we'll talk to you next Tuesday. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Enjoy. Bye-bye.